Okay. So this makes me turn to our first speaker, who is Philip Rathgeb. Philip is a political scientist, associate professor in social policy in the School of Social and Political Science at the University of Edinburgh. And his research interests are in the areas of comparative political economy, comparative politics, with a particular focus on welfare states, industrial relations, trade unions, and party politics. Currently, he's working on two different research projects, one on the political dimension of eco-social policies, so like greening, and one of them is the relationship between welfare, democracy, and autocracy in the 21st century with Erdem Yörük and myself. He is the author of Strong Governments, Precarious Workers, Labor Market Policy in the Era of Liberalization, 2018 Cornell University Press, and How Radical Right Has Changed Capitalism and Welfare in Europe and the USA. That came out in 2024 with Oxford University Press. And he will talk about this book and, of course, his thoughts based on the book that are more, he's into his current research areas. And this book has received the Richard Titmuss Book Award by the Social Policy Association and has been recently shortlisted for the Mackenzie Book Prize by the Political Studies Association. So it really is a must-read book in the area, and we are particularly happy to have Philip to kick off this seminar series. Thank you, Philip, for being here. So I give you the floor, and you can now share your PowerPoint, and yeah, we can start.
Thank you so much, Dorothea, for kicking this off, for organizing this seminar series. Thanks to Emeshe and everyone involved for making this happen. I'm extremely glad that this has been taken up so well with a lot of interest. So this is really truly rewarding to see so many participants today. So as Dorothea said, I'll start off by sharing my screen. So you should see my slides now. Could you perhaps confirm that you see my slides and can hear me okay? Excellent. Okay. Thanks for confirming. So the title, as you can see, is How the Radical Right Has Changed Capitalism and Welfare in Europe and the US. And what I'm going to do in my presentation is basically two things. The first one is to lay out the argument in response to the puzzle that has animated this book. Then there's a little break in between. Recall what Dorothea said. This is conceived as a doctoral seminar series. So this should also be an opportunity to engage doctoral students and as a source of inspiration, reflection, and engagement. So we'll have a prompt in between. Basically, I'm being curious what our doctoral students think about the argument and whether this is intuitive or counterintuitive. So a little break in between. And as Dorothea said, this will not be recorded. So just rest assured, what is going to be recorded is my presentation, but not any conversation we may have. And then I'll continue with a brief empirical illustration of the argument by talking about the American case, that is Donald Trump in power, before concluding and opening the floor for Q&A. Okay, so let me cut to the chase directly. What is the puzzle that has animated the book? That puzzle is what explains the diverse impact of radical right parties on social and economic policies in government since the 2000s. So in other words, why is it that under Donald Trump, we see a policy of trade protectionism, pulling out of free trade deals, imposing tariffs? Why is it that in Central and Eastern Europe, we see a policy of economic nationalism under Orban or the Kaczynskis, where there are discriminatory taxes and regulatory constraints on foreign capital? And why is it that in Western Europe, we see a policy of predominantly welfare chauvinism, selective cutbacks for immigrants, alongside the policy of insider protection, that is protecting the core workforce of the economy through selective social insurance programs. So what explains this variation? Well, for chauvinism, familialism, insider protection, trade protectionism across Europe on the one hand and the United States on the other. So I focus here on direct policy impact, so parties that have actually been in government. Oh, sorry, that shouldn't have happened. Right, so what's the motivation behind the puzzle? So there's obviously an academic rationale, a theoretical rationale of exploring cross-national variation, thereby gaining causal insights about the mechanisms underpinning variation. But I guess there's also political rationale motivation that led me to write this book. The first one is that what we can see across countries is growing electoral support for these parties, especially among those with lower levels of education, sometimes termed the losers of globalization, quote unquote. So I was interested in the extent to which, given this new electoral constituency these parties have attracted, what do they actually deliver to them in material terms? Second, also identifying the economic winners and losers of the radical right in power, in the sense that in the literature, what we see is a lot of research on attitudes. So what do voters want, basically, or on party positions, what do parties say in the manifestos, but not so much on their policy choices and the outcomes that come with that. And finally, and this cuts to the core of the seminar series, the assumption being that these parties need to mobilize support, need to mobilize legitimacy, and this can be an important component for democratic backsliding and illiberal rule. In other words, to legitimize attacks on the liberal component of a democracy by building support through social and economic policies. So in my talk, I will speak about the first 2 points in particular, but I'm very open to also expand on the third point in the Q&A session. So let's start off with historical background. So these parties have been around for a time, at least in Western Europe, so they are not a super recent phenomenon in the sense that their first electoral breakthroughs in the post-war era were in the 1970s and 1980s. And what characterized these parties on social economic policies was basically the claim that corrupt elites, they need to be disempowered, and you disempower them through tax cuts, welfare cuts, and privatization. So let us recall the 70s and 80s. That was the heyday of the Keynesian class compromise with high levels of state intervention. And the accusation by these parties was that high levels of taxes, high levels of welfare, and state-run industries are not a way of managing the economy or managing distribution, but rather one of self-enrichment. So they use these institutions in order to enrich themselves at the expense of the common man, if you will. And in this context, there was a book, a very influential book, I think, by Herbert Kitchell and Anthony McGann called The Radical Right in Western Europe, where they covered this period of the radical right masterfully, I think. And they coined the winning formula, that is the ideological outlook, programmatic outlook of these parties, as authoritarianism on the cultural dimension and neoliberalism on the economic dimension. So that was the winning formula with which they entered the political scene, had their first electoral breakthroughs in the 70s and 80s. To substantiate this a little bit, providing 3 examples here from that particular period. So you see on your left, Jean-Marie Le Pen, who called himself the French Ronald Reagan. So Ronald Reagan, you know, through Reaganomics, that was a period of neoliberal reform, of liberalization. And Le Pen considered himself the European force under the influence of Margaret Thatcher and Reagan. So a decidedly neoliberal outlook. And the tax revolt being mobilized under his reign. Similarly, Jörg Haider in Austria, that is the Austrian Freedom Party, arguing along similar lines that in order to reward the common man, you need to disempower duopoly of the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats, because they don't care about the pure people, and via tax cuts, welfare cuts, etc., we give voice to these people in a better way. And finally, Umberto Bossi from the Lega Nord, who had this famous slogan, Roma ladrona, Rome the thief, and ladri di Roma è finita, so thieves of Rome, it's over. We're no longer willing to pay taxes because these taxes they are used for corrupt practices, and therefore we need to get rid more or less of the welfare state. So you see here a kind of radical, a radical neoliberal outlook that informed this earlier generation of the radical right. However, these parties have changed quite a bit, and the book by Cas Mudde called Radical Right Parties in Europe captures that quite well, a book from 2007, which argues that the ideological formula of these parties have gradually changed, in the sense that two features have become more prominent. The first one is nativism, right? So nativism in reaction to globalization. So nativism being a defensive form of nationalism, especially targeted at immigration, being against immigration, but also against other cross-border movements mobilized by globalization, being the cross-border movement of goods, for example. And the kind of key slogan, perhaps that captures that very well, is the slogan Deutschland den Deutschen, Ausländer raus, so Germany to the Germans, foreigners out, which encapsulates the nativist core of these parties quite well, I think. And finally, authoritarianism that has gained further momentum in reaction to liberal value change, something Pippa Norris and Ronald Inglehart called a culture of backlash, in the sense that the notion liberal values have become too pervasive, and you see a cultural backlash on questions of gender identity, on national identity, on abortion in the United States as well, etc. So with this ideological toolkit, these parties then entered government from the 2000s. And this is the period where the book comes in, right? In the sense that I'm interested in how they influenced social and economic policies when they were in power. And the argument of the book, in short, can be summarized in 2 points. So I make 2 points in the book. The first one is to say that nativist and authoritarian ideology I've been just sketching out based on Cas Mudde's work, not only shapes the radical right's culture war on immigration, abortion, etc., but also shapes its distributive economic outlook, in the sense that it shapes the radical right's distributive deservingness conceptions. It gives them cues about the kinds of groups that are deserving of state support and groups that are not deserving of state support, which is important especially for their welfare state agendas. The second point I'm making is that these parties, they operate in vastly different political economies and capitalist contexts. So it makes a difference whether you are the head of, say, the president of the United States, or the chancellor of Austria, or the head of government in another country, in a sense that it creates different opportunities and constraints for the legislation of the radical right's deservingness agenda. And what I mean by that is that these welfare state contexts have been affected by globalization very differently, and thereby they stimulate different nativist contestations of globalization, going against the cross-border movement of goods in some contexts, or the cross-border movement of capital in other contexts. I'll sketch that argument out in greater detail on the following slide. Let's start off with the first part about how their ideology, on the one hand, translates into policy preferences on social and economic policy terms on the other. So let's start off with nativism. So nativism assumes that its natives, its citizens that are considered deserving of welfare state support, and immigrants are not. And the most common way of how that translates into policy implications is welfare chauvinism, something the literature has been talking about very extensively, but also pronatalism, in the sense that the assumption that you want to strengthen the reproductive capacity of your population without relying on immigration. And the economic mirror image of welfare chauvinism, in a sense, is economic nationalism, in a sense that you don't discriminate against foreign welfare claimants, as you would do under welfare chauvinism, but you discriminate against foreign companies. So it's a kind of business chauvinism, if you will. Authoritarianism, on the other hand, assumes that we need to reinvigorate traditional social values, strong norms, conventionalism, and the state should enforce that even by punishment if necessary. And the welfare state provides important tools to get to realize such an agenda by, first of all, distinguishing between labor market insiders and labor market outsiders. So that's a terminology from social policy research, which distinguishes between those in the core workforce in standard permanent employment on the one hand, and labor market outsiders, more precarious conditions or being unemployed. And labor market insiders in that ideology have claims to effort, to hard work, to achievement, and are therefore considered more deserving of welfare state support, which translates into a preference for insurance-based pension rights, elderly care, so those who've paid into the system, they are deserving, and workfare for those who are considered non-deserving because they haven't paid into the system so much. And finally, in the family policy angle, where you are aligned with the notion of more traditional male breadwinner families with clear gender roles and gender values and clearer demarcations between males and females, as opposed to working women and LGBTQ plus groups. And the way you realize that agenda is through monetary family support, thereby creating incentives to familialize care services rather than delegating them to the market or the state. And also compared to childcare, which would create a more equal playing field between men and women on the labor market. If you review what radical right parties do in power, you see different combinations of these policy choices, right? So as I noted at the outset, so welfare chauvinism is something Western European radical right parties, that has been their core claim. In Central and Eastern Europe, we see pronatalism being more prominent at earlier stage, or economic nationalism. In other contexts, you see workfare and other policy choices. So my question was then, okay, what explains that? And this is the second part then of my argument, where the notion of welfare state context comes in. So if we conceive of nativism as a response to globalization, we have to bear in mind that globalization has different features. And depending on the welfare state and growth model context, different features of that globalization are more likely to become contested. So in the generous welfare states of Western Europe, what we have is a situation of relatively high levels of immigration and relatively high levels of welfare generosity. So here the contested feature becomes very much the cross-border movement of people. Of course, all these parties are against immigration, that's clear. But in this context, immigration can be, so the welfare state becomes more racialized, more culturalized, in a sense that you can make a distinction between the foreign newcomers, they're entitled to something and they shouldn't be entitled. And that's what makes welfare chauvinism, or what is more conducive to welfare chauvinism from a nativist perspective, compared to welfare states that don't provide these generous entitlements to foreign newcomers. In Central and Eastern Europe, you have lower levels of immigration and arguably lower levels of welfare generosity. So even if there is welfare chauvinism towards ethnic minorities in particular, welfare chauvinism is less salient compared to Western Europe. But something we haven't seen in Western Europe so much is a policy of economic nationalism. And this goes back to the relatively high reliance on foreign direct investment in these countries, in the sense that with the post-communist transition phase, there was this important book called Making Capitalism Without Capital, in the sense that these countries, when the capital stock was diminished, there was a high reliance on attracting foreign capital and thereby generate economic growth. And this, of course, led to reverse capital flows in the wake of the global financial crisis, which created vulnerabilities economically. So this led to a contestation of the cross-border movement of capital and the high reliance of foreign capital. So here, the discrimination is targeted very much against foreign companies and transnational corporations in the service sectors in particular. And in the US, by contrast, here you also have lower levels of immigration. You have high levels of immigration, but lower levels of welfare entitlement. But here the contested feature is very much high levels of imports. So current account deficits have been traditionally very high over the last 3 to 4 decades. So here the contested feature is more the cross-border movement of goods, being reliant very much on European and increasingly Chinese and Mexican manufacturing goods, and the fallout of which has been aggressive deindustrialization, also facilitated by the US dollar as a global reserve currency, which strengthened the value of the US dollar and thereby hurt domestic competitiveness of manufacturing industries. You see, even though these are very different policies, they have a similar nationalist nativist core, contesting different elements of globalization, being the cross-border movement of people, welfare claimants, cross-border movement of capital, or cross-border movement of goods. And I think a comparative political economy perspective showing the different economic vulnerabilities of these welfare state contexts is helpful in understanding this variation. So with respect to authoritarianism in response to liberal value change, so here welfare states, they create feedback effects in the sense that some legacies are more conducive to familialism than others. And in Eastern and Continental Europe, you have more family conservative welfare states that entrench more conservative values and institutions, where I draw on data by the World Values Survey, which shows that in these countries, there are more conservative attitudes when it comes to the gender distribution in the household, when it comes to child rearing, especially compared to Northern Europe, where the dual earner, dual carer model is so entrenched. So the radical right parties see little point in mobilizing on familialism, which is different in these other countries. And finally, in Continental and Northern Europe, we have generous welfare states with costly social insurance arrangement. These legacies help to maintain and enhance insider protection for these core workforces by early retirement, for example, and other insurance related programs. Okay, so the book is it's not, you know, so I think it's 180 pages or so, but that's really the pattern I want to get at. So if you don't have time to read it or anything, that's really the crucial slide, I think, that captures the variation and the way I try to explain that variation, in the sense that in Continental Europe, you have strong welfare states, so immigrants shouldn't benefit from it. That's why welfare chauvinism, and insiders, they should. You have a strong legacy of family conservatism. That's why these parties are more aligned, so in Austria or Germany, for example, to push for child benefits and other more familialist policies. In Northern Europe, by contrast, you don't have a conservative legacy on the family, so these parties don't push for familialism to the same extent. In Central and Eastern Europe, you have also more conservative values in the broader electorate, and you are affected by the reverse capital flows that we've seen in the wake of the global financial crisis, which inspired this economic nationalism. And the US being kind of unique in the sense that you don't have a European-style welfare state, so you need a functional equivalent of social protection, in the sense that the welfare state is more racialized and reliant on low taxes, and that functional equivalent is trade protection, in a sense that it helps workers affected by deindustrialization to either retain their jobs and thereby their benefits, or even gain some of them. So trade protection here understood as a functional equivalent of social protection, and it serves a similar function of protecting against the fallout of globalization. A quick note on method and case selection. So I used the process tracing approach, where I compared the predictions of my claim with predictions of alternative claims that focused more on voters and electoral class compositions. And I complemented that with shadow case studies, the idea being to show that this is not just an artifact of case selection, but among similar welfare states, we see similar patterns of radical right economic and social policy. So that being Germany, Italy compared to Austria, Sweden and Norway compared to Denmark, Poland compared to Hungary, and the United States is a kind of standalone case because it's quite unique and even quite different to the British case, I would argue. And the expected outcome is that the radical right uses these different welfare instruments to protect the deserving groups of voters, that is, insiders and male breadwinners in particular. I used also survey data to address competing outcomes and used Oesch's class schema in a sense that the literature made predictions about the kind of policies we should see dependent on the voters they have. So I tried to address those alternative claims via survey data and use public opinion data, macroeconomic indicators more broadly to capture the opportunities and constraints these parties have. Okay, so here's a little break and a taking stock. So basically now turning to the audience and especially to PhD researchers here in our room, where I'm curious of whether the idea, the argument is sketched out that cultural values can shape economic positions, right? So when we think of the economy, we tend to think of class, we tend to think of labor versus capital, we tend to think of left versus right. And here the claim is that these cultural values, this ideology is what drives these economic positions. So I'm wondering, just a first question to animate that discussion, whether that sounds counterintuitive or whether you see something similar maybe in your own research, your own interest. And finally, the second part of the claim being that these economic positions are then mediated by welfare state contexts. So this may invite a reflection or a discussion to what extent institutional mechanisms play a role in your research too. Okay, so I'll proceed now with one empirical chapter and then I conclude. So thanks again for the comments and the discussion we've had already. So chapter 7 is the US case study, and basically it starts from the observation that probably I should add that the book was published in 2024. So I covered Trump 1.0. I don't cover Trump 2.0, although I'm happy to reflect on the ways in which there are differences in degree or differences in kind compared to Trump 1.0. So drawing on secondary sources, the starting point was to say that Trump's platform, especially Tea Party support, which later then evolved towards the MAGA movement, resembled the European radical right in the sense that it was nativist in outlook, anti-immigration, and had an authoritarian law and order bent to it. So I tried to compare the Trump's policy performance on the one hand with the one we could see among radical right parties in other European countries. And the question the chapter raises is, why did Trump diverge from the European radical right through trade protectionism, in the sense that this has not been politicized trade to that extent in Europe. And this leads me to theorize the role of growth model and welfare state context, as I said early on. So the first thing to note is that the American welfare state context undermines radical right support for social policy expansion. First of all, in the sense that there is a long legacy of racialization, where critical scholars showed how home ownership programs have been designed predominantly for white middle-class families, whereas punitive social assistance programs predominantly for Black Americans, and this has been captured through debates by the underclass, for example. And secondly, most Americans and middle-class citizens, they are invested in private social welfare programs rather than public welfare programs. So there's an interest in low taxes, which can help middle-class citizens to afford healthcare, for example, right? So there is, on the one hand, a highly residual welfare state with broad opposition to tax increases, and you don't want particular groups in society to benefit from redistribution. So welfare state, social policies hardly available as a kind of protective instrument in that context for the radical right. So that's why I argue that trade protection can act as a functional equivalent of social protection, catering to sort of deserving, hardworking production workers that is threatened labor market insiders. And even if the China shock, for example, hasn't been the kind of only or even the main cause of deindustrialization, but it has been the cause most visible to the public that has been politicized along those lines. And that economic context of chronic trade deficits on the one hand, and the lack of European-style social safety nets created opportunities for Trump's globalization backlash, which is arguably not a particularly new argument, in the sense that there has been a book by Katzenstein in 1985 called Small States and Open Markets. And he has argued that the reason why European welfare states managed to uphold globalization is because they had safety nets, right? That buffered the fallout of being open, being exposed to the whim of the global economy, which you don't have to that extent in the United States. So let me perhaps differentiate that a little bit. So this is Trump's presidential announcement speech back in 2015, where I don't read the whole thing out loud, basically arguing that people can't get jobs. There are no jobs because China has our jobs and Mexico has our jobs. I'll bring back our jobs from China, from Mexico, from Japan, from so many places. So this was quite unusual at the time for a Republican candidate, in a sense that there has been a cross-party consensus between the Democrats and the Republicans in favor of freer trade. Note that I say freer trade rather than free trade, because there's never been free trade in the US. The US has always been more protectionist, actually, than European countries. But there has been the signing of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which create this common trade agreement in North America with Mexico included, and a push to integrate China into the World Trade Organization, which exposed the US to a greater extent, which again was a cross-party consensus. And Trump disrupted that in the presidential announcement speech here. And which then he reaffirmed when coming to power, saying we must protect our borders from the ravages of other countries, making our products, stealing our companies, and destroying our jobs. Protection will lead to great prosperity and strength. So that's been the campaign and the outlook, and you see the salience of trade in this economic platform at a relatively early stage. To maybe get to the political economy context to that a little bit, to see that background here. So this is compares exports and imports in percent of GDP from 1980 to 2020. And you see that this has been a long-standing feature, that there are import surpluses, but these have expanded quite a bit in the wake of NAFTA and the integration of China into the World Trade Organization. So this has been brewing for quite a while, arguably. And it's also reflected in average current account balances in continental Europe, Northern Europe, the US, and the Visegrad region, where you see that in continental Europe and Northern Europe, so two other comparative cluster comparisons, these countries have benefited from export surpluses. They are gradually coming under pressure from China, especially in automobile production. But in the period of observation here, export surpluses have been an important feature to fund these welfare states, and therefore trade protection is less feasible in that context. In the Visegrad countries, there's Poland, Slovakia, Czech Republic, and Hungary, you also see current account deficits in the wake of the transition period, but that gradually closed through the 2000s. And it's the US where you see trade deficits being rather chronic and doesn't and don't change much, which also had an impact on public opinion. So here you see the share of respondents who see foreign trade mainly as an opportunity rather than a threat by party identification. And this is quite interesting in a sense. So I covered a period in the run-up to Trump's first election, in a sense that from 2001 until 2011, it's been Republican voters who have been more in favor of foreign trade. And this gradually switched, where you see the electoral realignment gradually occurring, whereby it's Democrats, voters of the Democratic Party, being more in favor of foreign trade, and the whole cosmopolitan package that comes with that, and Republican voters being less inclined to see it as an opportunity rather than a threat in that period of investigation. If we divide this poll by education, we see that it's been especially those with high school or less degrees that are most critical of foreign trade. And that's been the surprising feature of the primaries was back in 2015, was that Trump explicitly tried to attract these voters, right? So explicitly reaching out to back then white working class voters in particular by politicizing trade along those lines. And I hasten to add that there has been a kind of long-term realignment in the sense that already under Mitt Romney, we see growing working class support for the Republican Party and growing university graduate support for the Democrat Party. But under Trump, this reached a new peak, a kind of reinforcement of that. So I guess I'm trying to, because Trump's policy style may be erratic in many ways, but when it comes to trade, judging from the opinion data and the current account deficit data, we have tapped into something here. That's what I'm trying to get across here. So shortly on the policy. So what is it that we find here? So on the one hand, neoliberal continuity with the 2017 Tax and Jobs Act, it was called, and financial deregulations in line with previous GOP policies. So you may argue, okay, Trump is on the one hand quite neoliberal and thereby sustains these legacies. And there has been evaluations by the National Tax Policy Institute, which is not affiliated to one of the two major parties, that showed how this corporate tax cut especially benefited top 1% predominantly. And this went hand in hand with cuts to anti-poverty programs. So there you see how the kind of old GOP style, the Koch network, basically, which is a network of neoliberal think tanks and wealthy donors, have been catered to through this type of policies. And it remains to be seen to what extent a new tech oligarchy that lined up behind Trump in Trump 2.0. You may have seen the inauguration speech where you saw all these powerful people basically swearing more or less allegiance, if you will, to Trump, and how that is going to shape the neoliberal imprint of Trump's economic platform. At the same time, and this I think is the most distinctive feature of Trump from a historical perspective, the abandonment of free trade by pulling out of TTIP, for example, immigration control now being reinforced by deportations, and the introduction of most sweeping tariffs since the 1930s. So that's been protectionism, something that deviates from previous administrations. So interestingly, on the one hand, you could argue, and I think that's also what ethnographic research from the Rust Belt and ethnographic scholars suggest, is that it helps Trump to portray himself as someone who cares about the Rust Belt, who cares about those who have been particularly affected by deindustrialization. But in terms of economic outcomes, America's trade deficit changed only slightly until the pandemic. So it hasn't had the effect it was meant to have at the moment. And finally, it's also useful to bear in mind that Trump promised to protect Social Security, which is the pension insurance, and Medicare, which is a federal healthcare system for those above 65 years old. And that's also an interesting deviation from previous Republican candidates. If you think of George W. Bush, who had the vision of an ownership society, and part of that was to privatize Social Security, and Trump was rather firm on that. And we're recording this on the 25th of February, 2026. I just had a brief look into the transcript of his State of the Nation speech that happened yesterday. That is the 24th of February. And it's interesting how he reaffirmed that claim he made in 2016. And under this administration, we'll always protect Social Security and Medicare. They are not, here he refers to the Democrats, they are not protecting it for our seniors. We will always protect Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. A statement that has been taken with a grain of salt, in the sense that there has been cuts to Medicaid and Social Security, especially when it comes to the administration of it. But in terms of entitlements, Trump here appears adamant in catering to these policies, which I think is also important for him to cater to his MAGA base alongside the tech oligarchy I was referring to before. So I will conclude now with broader analytical implications and then look forward to the discussion. So taking stock again. So in my talk, I've now covered the sources of variation in the radical right social and economic policy impact and used the US case as an example. And I had 4 empirical chapters, and that was a short sketch of one of them. So I want to conclude with the broader analytical implications of the book. First, on theoretical implications. The first one, again, going back to the culture economy claim, in the sense that nativism has economic implications, that it discriminates against foreign goods, foreign companies, and foreign welfare claimants in response to globalization. And authoritarianism wants to restore law and order and traditional gender values in the welfare state domain in response to liberal cultural values. So the welfare state being turned into a terrain of the culture war, if you will, as an economic institution, but being subject to these culture war contestations. And the implication being here that we can no longer make a rigid distinction between culture versus economy, in the sense that cleavage models are typically based on that distinction between there's a cultural cleavage, there's an economic cleavage, and you can separate them out. And I think once we realize how the two are intersected, it helps us understand why the radical right, despite growing working class support, is not interested in the redistributive state intervention. So it has an interventionist and a protectionist platform, but it's not redistributive in a vertical sense, redistributing from the rich to the poor. In terms of distributive implications, so the winners, leaving out cross-national variation for the moment, are typically, or the beneficiaries, the target groups being threatened labor market insiders, so those, the core workforce, coming under pressure from globalization, deindustrialization, and male breadwinners, alongside domestic capital, which translates into what I call a policy of selective status protection, which is not necessarily functionally expedient, as we saw in the trade protectionism story of Donald Trump. But that's been the policy outlook we can see among these parties. And the losers of the radical right in power, typically the unemployed and the poor, being considered not deserving, not doing their bit for the national cause, translating into workfare programs, immigrants and ethnic minorities, not part of the national boundaries, borders of solidarity, if you want, working women as well, in the sense that not being interested in public childcare to that extent, being more in favor of a conservative labor family policy, and the precarious sections, that is labor market outsiders. So trying to summarize these disparate policy choices, argue that what goes hand in hand is a policy of selective status protection with the promotion of a racialized and gendered precariat. So in other words, putting this more in sociological inequality research terms, that their status protections go hand in hand with increased horizontal inequalities among social groups, along gender and ethnicity, without addressing vertical inequality or actually increasing vertical inequality, as in the American case I was just referring to, between rich and the poor. In terms of political implications, I think at its most basic, what I'm trying to get across here is that the radical right not only matters for the culture war, but also for capitalism and welfare. And that may no longer be a particularly controversial claim these days. But I guess when I was starting to work on this project, it was, in the sense that these parties used to be analytically confined to immigration policy rather than capitalism and welfare. And I guess from political standpoint, that the political mainstream needs to think of status guarantees for these voters exposed to structural economic change. I think if you weave together these insights on this literature, one thing that stands out among voters is typically this, how economic change creates status anxieties, status threats, which can then be mobilized along those scapegoating dynamics, right? So that that then can be mobilized on anti-immigration agenda. So basically, good jobs is something what a demand that unites radical right voters, having good jobs, and thereby not being exposed so much to the ramifications of the knowledge economy that created these urban-rural divides to a greater extent, which also has to do, I would argue, with deindustrialization, because the manufacturing sector was very effective in providing good jobs to people outside of cities without university education. And governments have been struggling very much in providing good jobs to people outside cities and outside the manufacturing economy. So I think that's something to reflect about, politically speaking. And finally, and this cuts to the chase of the seminar series, that welfare state reform, something I haven't, I only reflected in the concluding chapter, I hasten to add, but writing the book made me think there's something to the idea that welfare state reform is an important instrument for the radical right to build popular legitimacy and facilitate democratic backsliding. So it's interesting to get into the mechanisms of how the welfare state may be implicated in authoritarianism, where there's an older literature in the European welfare state literature going back to Bismarck, and there's also newer literature in the outside the Western welfare states covering electoral autocracies that also are focusing on mechanisms such as clientelism, loyalty, etc., where the welfare state can become implicated in these regime stabilizations and regime shifts. Okay, I leave it at that, and thank you everyone for your attention. In case you're interested, you may also check out a review symposium that came out recently in the Journal of Socio-Economic Review, where the book was reviewed by 5 great scholars, and I had the pleasure to write a rejoinder to these reviews. And if you're interested in shorter summaries of the book, you find the first chapter online, and the blog summary in the blog called Social Policy Worldwide. So thanks everyone for your attention. I look forward to the Q&A session now.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Particularly, Philippe, to you by kicking off this seminar series with such a wonderful lecture. And special thanks to those of you, those students who raised their hands and asked questions and made really, really valuable comments. So we hope to continue also with that interactive part of the seminar series in a week from now, when we will have the next lecture that will be by me. So thank you again for being here, and I hope to see many of you next week. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.